In 1808, the United States of America banned the slave trade. With this, from now on, no slaves could be imported into the United States from Africa. Yet, there were ways to illegally smuggle slaves and bring them to the country. But there was more. Loopholes were left. Instead of banning slavery, only the slave trade was banned. Yes, the state was helping the brutal slave owners. This gave them an excuse to do unimaginable to get more slaves from the already ones they had. Ban of the slave trade was not the only problem for them. The high rate of death among slaves was costing them profits. They have to do something so as not to let that happen. So they resorted to one of the most inhumane and immoral ways by establishing breeding farms. Yet people don't know what was done there. Welcome to the Black History Archives, a channel where we present the forgotten Black history and events that every Black or white should know. We feel Black people are often misguided by being bombarded with propaganda that forces them to forget their glory. Our goal is to educate you about the factual events that shape everything. Let's build a Black community that grows together. In this video, we will explain how Black slave breeding farms were established, what was done there, and how the state did nothing against them. Let's get started.
The Black History Archives.
As the 19th century began, there was growing opposition to the transatlantic slave trade. This made it more difficult for colonial powers to acquire new slaves from overseas. However, the inhumane treatment of enslaved individuals persisted within America itself. Throughout the 18th century, laws were passed that degraded and dehumanized the enslaved population, reducing them to nothing more than objects owned by their masters. Shockingly, buying and selling human beings became a disturbingly normal part of American society, with few objections raised. The prohibition of slave importation to the United States might seem like a positive step, but it was primarily driven by economic reasons rather than a genuine concern for human rights. Slave owners saw this as an opportunity to increase the value of domestic slaves, treating people as mere commodities for production. Despite the decline of the transatlantic slave trade, the brutal institution of slavery and the demand for slave labor remained strong in America. Valuable crops like sugarcane, cotton, and rice in the South and Western regions made slave labor a highly profitable venture. As more people called for the abolition of slavery, there were still those who believed in the economic benefits of slave labor, particularly in the lucrative cotton industry. This belief led them to think that conflicts with northern states could be avoided. After the prohibition of slave importation in 1808, slave owners turned their attention to breeding, chillingly referring to it as a natural increase. This cruel practice affected Black women enslaved in America the most, as they were expected to bear 4 to 5 children, turning their fertility into a highly prized commodity. Tragically, Black female slaves were often subjected to forced pregnancies and births, with little regard for their well-being or autonomy. The mortality rate among slaves was distressingly high, and their suffering was tragically seen as a necessary aspect of the breeding practice. Plantation owners have been forcing Black enslaved girls to have children at the age of only 13. At the age of 20, Black enslaved women had to have over 5 children. Otherwise, they faced brutality. Black enslaved women were more than just an economic commodity. She was an economic good and a sex tool, so she was used for breeding, in addition to the laborious jobs she did on plantations. The slave owners, their sons, neighbors, and guests would take turns on Black women to breed them and have more slaves. Black enslaved women were promised freedom if they bore 15 children meant to be slaves. Imagine being just 13 years old and already burdened with the expectation of bearing children for your masters. By the time these young women reached the age of 20, they would have been subjected to 4 to 5 pregnancies, their bodies and minds pushed to the limits. This system demanded them to breed, leaving them vulnerable and exposed to unimaginable suffering. Heartbreakingly, the slave market of 19th century America did not hesitate to sell women slaves even when they were pregnant, further perpetuating their misery. This was a cycle of despair for these female slaves: rape, pregnancy, and uncared for births with hardly any time for recovery before the vicious cycle repeated itself. Masters and slave owners showed a complete lack of moral restraint, fathering children with no regard for the rights or personhood of their victims. It's hard to find words to describe the horror of systematically forcing children out of these women, an act that can only be termed as cruel and devastatingly abusive. Enjoying the video so far? If yes, here's a little reminder to like the video and subscribe to our channel to get more videos on Black history and culture. Let's continue now. The breeding farms were a breeding ground for injustice, with white owners illegally protected while their black counterparts had no rights or recourse. Yes, the state and the leaders were providing the slave owners with legal cover. Even the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, was involved as he himself was a slave owner. Smithsonian Magazine published a detailed article on Thomas Jefferson's dark side, which the world does not know about. Historian David Bryan Davis delves into the intricate complexities of Thomas Jefferson's perspectives on slavery. He acknowledges Jefferson's early advocacy for concrete measures to restrict and eradicate slavery, showcasing the Founding Fathers' liberal aspirations. However, Davis highlights a significant shift in Jefferson's stance during the 1790s, as a puzzling silence emerged on the subject of slavery, and his efforts toward emancipation seemed to fade away. During the relatively brief span between the 1780s and the early 1790s, something changed within Jefferson. The very existence of slavery during the American Revolution presented a moral dilemma that had largely been left unexamined, allowing individuals like Jefferson to remain morally suspended and bypass the full implications of the appalling abomination that was slavery. It is said that his anti-slavery passage from the Declaration of Independence was removed, but nobody knows whether he wrote it or whether this is just said to make him look decent. The complex nature of Jefferson's relationship with slavery becomes apparent when we explored his home Monticello. Examining this estate closely, we can observe the gradual process through which he rationalized the practice of slavery and sought to reconcile it with America's national identity and ambitions. But Jefferson was not alone. Back in 1819, the United States passed an act that allowed its ships not only to patrol its own shores, but also the coast of Africa, aiming to intercept slave ships before they could reach American soil. However, the true motivation behind this measure was not driven by a desire to end slavery. Rather, it was primarily intended to safeguard the interests of American slave owners. The whole scheme hinged on maintaining a self-sustaining population of approximately 4 million slaves within the country during that period. Both Southern and Northern legislators collaborated to pass these acts, which outwardly banned the external slave trade while conveniently sidestepping the pressing issue of slavery within the nation. Yes, sexual abuse was rampant, and the intrusion into the intimate lives of enslaved individuals was deemed normal, perpetuating the dehumanization of these innocent souls. The breeding culture mirrored the practices of animal husbandry, with arranged marriages and forced mating being common occurrences. Enslaved people were treated as nothing more than property, and their breeding conditions were akin to those of animals. Male slaves known as stockmen were imported to impregnate female slaves owned by specific individuals, all in an effort to maximize the number of laborers fit for arduous physical work in the fields. A shocking study by economist Richard Stouch in 1860 revealed a staggering ratio of around 2 female slaves for every male slave in Virginia. This skewed gender ratio, with hundreds of thousands more females than males, pointed to the existence of a highly profitable domestic breeding industry. Slavery in America was deeply entwined with racist ideology, and slave owners considered it their righteous duty to exert absolute control over their slaves. House slaves, in particular, faced the constant threat of being victims of their master's rape. The repercussions of such abuse led many childbearing slaves to protect their offspring from the master's wife, fearing the revelation of the true father's identity. All these horrifying practices were driven by one sinister motive: profit. Slave traders shamelessly discussed the profitability of their breeding farms, boasting about the thousands of slave children they could sell each year. Figures like Thomas Jefferson even took pride in the financial gains derived from the birth of black children. The slave trade's profitability reached unimaginable heights, estimated to be worth around $4 billion by the mid-1800s, overshadowing other economic sectors. The dehumanizing nature of slavery reduced people to mere property, leading to the establishment of a chilling financial system. Southern states capitalized on the value of their enslaved population by using them as collateral for loans from banks. These mortgaged slaves were bundled into bonds that were sold globally, enabling people from regions where slavery had been abolished to profit from this reprehensible system. The legacy of the slave trade is a grim reminder of how economic interests, exploitation, and systemic racism can intertwine to inflict unimaginable suffering on fellow human beings. The legal and financial mechanisms that sustain this abhorrent practice serve as a reminder of America's darkest moments. Various reports have been published which prove that slavery was the main engine of the American economy. Yes, slavery did make America, and people should know this. Did you know these harsh facts about slave breeding? Isn't it true that the state was assisting slave owners to establish breeding farms and have more slaves? Let us know your take on this. Would you like to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to the Black History Archives and click the bell icon. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.